All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 9:30, and it's always fun to walk in the door and they're like, "Oh, here's your mic. It's time to go." So my apologies for running a little behind this morning here. But good to see everybody without mask on for a change, and hopefully we can get to more and more of that. So we're continuing on in Luke, chapter 20, verses 9 through 19 today. And the basis of the story is cornerstone. And when we think about a cornerstone, what do we think about? What's kind of the first thing that comes to mind?
Building.
A building. Okay. What part of a building?
The foundation.
The foundation. Yeah. The corner. The cornerstone. Yeah. So, and why is it important? What's so important about a cornerstone in a building project? We got the foundation. Does it matter if it's shaky?
Yes.
No, it does. Okay. Does it matter if we have that in our life? Yeah. There's a lot of things we face in each day. You know, some planned, some unplanned. But if we have a cornerstone, if we have a base that we can rely on, you know, then we know we've got that foundation to handle anything that's thrown at us. And so, you know, and we've got that. We've got that through salvation in Christ. And we're going to kind of go through that today with the idea that, with two kind of ideas. One being that there's a decision that has to be made, and everybody has to make that decision on their own. And through, you know, but there are also consequences that go with decisions, right? You know, and so there's that's and that can be a struggle. That's not saying it's an easy, you know, path. But we have, you know, through Scripture, we see different scenarios where God gives the guidance and gives the direction and gives the instruction that's needed to help avoid the consequences that we don't want to have to face. I don't think anybody wants to spend eternity separated from God. That's not something that, you know, is enticing, or, you know, but a lot of people don't think about that. We live in a culture now where it's all about today and what's going to make me happy today and right now. You know, and so we're not looking at the long-term kind of plan of things. And God's looking at salvation. Salvation's eternal. And if you choose not to accept salvation, that's an eternal choice as well. But as we get into the lesson and as we kind of see how things go, the cornerstone, and we're all going to be based around the parable that Jesus is kind of going through. And I'm not going to hit all the details of it right now because we'll go through it during the lesson. But it's very clear that the parable he's trying to teach and the message he's trying to get across is that of salvation and that of being thoughtful in how we, you know, go at life and how we, you know, look at situations. So with that, you know, turn it over to Jonathan. Let him.
Screen here, just the overview in the three sections that we're going to be in today. Of course, Jeff alluded to the 20th chapter of Luke, verses 9 through 19. It's going to be the parable of the wicked vine dresser. And we're going to talk about Jesus' teachings, but there are three sections: the servant, the son, and the stone. And as we see that, and as we get into this lesson, the overall theme that you can see listed in your text is that God offers salvation through faith in Jesus alone. Let me restate that again. Of course, God offers salvation to all of us through His Son, Jesus Christ, and through faith in Jesus Christ alone. You know, as I was studying and preparing for this lesson, and just put it into context with everything that we've dealt with through the past year, and of course that's in the forefront of many of our minds, I thought about Matthew 16:26 and Jesus' teaching. And in Matthew 16:26 it says, "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world?" And y'all know the next part. What is it? But loses his soul. And if you think about that when you're thinking about the wicked vine dressers in Jesus' parable, I think it'll put this in perspective, and it's a strong lesson for each and every one of us. As we begin the lesson, I took a picture yesterday and put it in this presentation, and I hope everyone can recognize what this is. Right? So what is this? That's right, it's the medallion that's on the front of the old sanctuary. Okay? And of course it has the date when our church was organized. And really this is representative of a cornerstone. Okay? But if we took this stone out of the brick facade there at the front of the church, what would happen? Somebody that's very intelligent as it comes to building, Ted, what would happen if we took this out? Most likely. Would the building crumble? No, it wouldn't crumble, because this is only a representation, right? It's aesthetically pleasing, of course. It reminds us of when our church was organized, and many of us are very proud of this, right? Not just the building, but what it represents, right? But it's not a true cornerstone. And as we go through the lesson today, you need to understand that Jesus Christ is the true cornerstone and has to be the true cornerstone of our lives individually, and then to take it one step further, of our church here, and then the church worldwide collectively. So let's keep that in mind as we go through the first section. The first section, you can see a few key points. We're going to read verses 9 through 12. I'm going to read those. Of course, Jesus told a parable about the vineyard owner who went away. And he went away, and when he went away, he sent servants to retrieve the share of his fruit that had been produced. And the 3 servants were all beaten and treated unjustly and unfairly and sent away empty-handed. So I'm going to read verses 9 through 12. And keep in mind as we go through this, there's a lot of symbolism in this parable. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the symbolism as it relates to who is represented here through the Scripture. So he went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. Verse 12, he sent still a third, and they wounded him and they threw him out. So this parable offers a strong response from Jesus to the challenges that were being presented to him at this point in time. Most biblical scholars think this event took place on Tuesday of Passion Week. On Tuesday of Passion Week, what led up to this is he cleansed the temple, right? Remember, the money changers were there. He came in. He was angry. He turned them over. He sent them away because they were not about his Father's business in the temple. How often do I wonder, are we about the Father's business here when we come organized as a church? But that's not today's lesson. So now we have the religious leaders, and they're very offended. They're angry. They're hateful towards Jesus because they see him as a threat to their power. You know, the religious leaders were not leading Israel in a godly manner at this point in time. They were leading them in a way that was unjust and that was corrupt. You think about the corruption that existed in the temple just with the money changers and what was going on, but it was much deeper than that. They were using their positional power to manipulate individuals for money, fame, and power. Do we know people in this world today that manipulates their positions for money, fame, and power? And yes, we do. We do, and we could name, but we're not going to do that. But like I said, Tuesday leading up to Good Friday, and we all know what took place on Good Friday, right? So we're really 3 days away from Jesus' crucifixion. And just like Jesus always was, his timing was perfect, and his words and his teaching was perfect. But the vineyard is representative of the Old Testament Israel. I want you to understand we see references to the Old Testament to Israel being a vineyard. And of course we see that the vineyard was established by God and it was organized by God. The landowner who owns the vineyard is representative of who? God the Father. God the Father, the Holy One, the Sovereign One. And the servants that were sent to obtain the fruit are representative of the Old Testament prophets. And we see the Old Testament prophets, God would raise them up throughout the Old Testament, would give them a word and would communicate to His people through the prophets, right? God's hand was upon them. They were divinely inspired by God for a purpose to lead Israel. But what so frequently happened with the prophets? They came with words that were confrontational, that were godly, and it was rebuking the Israelites for being out of God's will. And so what happened? The Israelites didn't want to hear it. So many times they punished, they ignored, they refused, and even put to death the prophets of the Old Testament. So that's the symbolism here in the story. We see that the landowner went away for a long time, and we have to be careful not to misunderstand or misrepresent this, that God was absent. God was never absent in the Old Testament. We understand that He always has had His hand upon the people of Israel and the nation of Israel. And I will challenge you and say this politically, publicly, whatever we go through here as a nation as a whole, God's hand will always be on the nation of Israel. He is not an absentee God. He was just not present in the flesh there. He was leading them through the prophets. And so verses 10 through 12 is clear that the owner didn't frequently come to the vineyard. He had entrusted the vineyard, the nation of Israel, of course, to the people that were caring for it. And also, he had trust that they were going to handle and be good stewards of what they had been entrusted. So for that reason, he didn't send a militia, a large army, or a group of people. He sent 3 individual servants. He sent 3 individual servants. And then what do we see that happened to the servants? Each and every one of them. As they approached the people that were considered the tenant farmers that were to care for and take care of this vineyard and the fruit and the crop, what happens to each and all of them? Well, they killed them, they beat them, they mistreated them, they punished them, they sent them away. So it's representative of God's chosen leaders, right? God's chosen leaders. This type of behavior shows something about the hearts of the tenant farmers. Hearts of the tenant farmers, of course, were evil and their motives were not godly. It's representative of the religious leaders. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the religious leaders knew that Jesus was speaking about them as he was teaching this parable. But he was not only teaching this parable to them because they had been so unwilling to listen, he was teaching it to a group of other people that were there, that were present, that could hear. And he was trying to inspire them. Luke 13:34, Jesus laments over Israel. He says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, and you were not willing." God was always willing. He's always been willing to be there for us. But mistreating God's servants and the religious leaders who had mistreated God's servants throughout history points to contempt towards the individual. But more importantly, it points to contempt and hate towards God. So who are some examples of God's servants that we see today? Who are some examples of God's servants that we see today?
We should all be.
All of us. Christians. What else? But specifically within the church. Pastors, of course. Teachers. Deacons. Church workers. There are so many people that are called to do a specific work by God, and how we interact with them and treat them, 1, publicly, but 2, face to face, but 3rd, when we're not with them. It's important that we treat people correctly, because if they're called and are doing a job that is given to them by God, we should be very mindful of how we interact with them. So we see this, and we see that it was an example of how not to treat the individuals that were coming to the tenant farmers here. But as we get into the second section, I'm going to let Jeff read the second section. It's titled The Son, and you can see on the screen the few key points, and at this point I'll let Jeff go through it.
All right, so if you'll join me in your books, if you got them, verses 13 through 16a actually. So the excuse me. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. So let's take a moment. Let's look at this from a couple of different angles. We certainly know that Jesus is teaching a parable, and so he's in a conversation with a crowd at the temple, and when you start thinking about rhetorical questions, and Jesus often put rhetorical questions in the parables. What would you do if you were the vineyard owner? Let's just look at it from a human perspective. And we've seen throughout Scripture that the Israelites needed constant reminding of where they came from and who brought them to the point where they're at now, and how things have kind of progressed. And they were. He was, to an extent, Jesus was fighting a battle against the religious leaders because of the idea of the power that they held and they thought they held. But yeah, it references back to kind of the reasoning for all this. But he's, he puts a question out there, and you got to think that the audience is going to be pondering over and wondering how they would do it themselves, how they would proceed with that. And not that rhetorical questions are ever meant to be answered, but it does that. It gets you. The intent was to make them think, and to think how would I respond in this situation, but we see here as we move on here, the vineyard owner was hoping, he's going to send his son, whom he loves, and whom he loves is kind of the way it's worded, is a dear possession, or something that he has got the utmost, that's dearly loved or very unique. Whom I love, perhaps they will respect him. That's what you hope would happen. That is the best case scenario. If they certainly disregarded, these tenant farmers disregarded everything else I'd sent, every other person that was sent on my behalf. Maybe if I send my son, they'll respect him, they'll listen to him, they'll do what our agreement was. But that's not the case, and I think that's what we saw throughout. We've seen with the leaders. Verse 14. But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So, and I kind of, when you think about that, and I think it often makes me think about culture and where we're at today. How short-sighted are we? It's about what's going to affect us, and it's about how it's going to affect us, and it's about how it's not about about eternity, and that goes into a lot of different things. We're in a culture where we want things now, and we need instant gratification. But so they saw the son coming, and then they had a plan. It wasn't a spur of the moment. If this happens, we can handle it this way. This was thought through. This was something, and in most normal situations, if the tenants, killed the heir, does that mean the property would go to them? Would the owner automatically give the property to the tenants?
That's a good point, because if you look at this, Jesus there wasn't any fluff in what he said. I think there was a purpose in everything that he said. Now, from our perspective, if you kill the son, you sure don't inherit what the son would have inherited.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand exactly what his point was here, unless I'm not sure I understand what his point was there. I do think he was talking about the Israelites versus others, but I don't quite get them thinking that they would inherit.
Well, and you got to keep in mind too that not only was the general crowd there, but the religious leaders that were against him were in the crowd as well, because they were trying to find ways to use against him, to take him out, for lack of better terms. But I guess in my mind, the thought there, Archie, is that if from their perspective, this is a kind of a reminder, and as we Jonathan will talk more about kind of the thought processes at the end, but the religious leaders, it's all about me, and it's all about my power, and it's all about my standing in the community. And if we're, as the parable teaches, and as we go through it, and Jesus is this son, that's being sent by God to the Israelites, and they, him saying it this way lets them also know that he's aware of the plan. Because they've been talking about killing him. They've been talking about doing away with him. And it would make you step back if somebody that you're planning against or plotting against come out and in a general audience and said, they're gonna, in a parable, they're trying to kill me, or their intent is to kill me. So I think there's some things there that in my mind would make the religious leaders want to step back and say, there's.
So this was directed.
I think there's some understanding that this was maybe more targeted to their mindset. But like I said, in general, we've got the son, and we see in the parable that the owner sent the son. He sent him hoping that everything would turn out well. And when we think about that in comparison to God and Jesus, did God send Jesus thinking it would turn out well? Absolutely not. He knew exactly from the moment that decision was made that he was going to be crucified. But he did it. He did it so that we would have opportunities for salvation, that the Israelites would have opportunities for salvation. He knew that Jesus would be rejected and crucified, and that's why he sent him, and that's why Jesus came. His purpose was to die on the cross to atone for human sin and to make forgiveness and salvation possible. If this had never happened, we would never be sitting here with this opportunity to talk about salvation and to talk about the fact that we do know where we're heading after this life's over. And so I'm going to have to hurry up here. Jonathan's going to throw me off the stage here. Verse 15, so they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? And again, another rhetorical question, but you got to be I would say think through how the crowd would be responding. What would they do if somebody had killed their son? We could spend an hour talking about just that, how people would respond to that. It wouldn't go well. But we see in 16a here that there's three different things that were mentioned. Jesus comes back and says he will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. So you got the three action items there. He will come. So the Father initially, so the Father's going to come. He's going to respond. He's not just going to stay back and sit on his laurels and not respond to that himself. Second thing he's going to do, very likely he's going to kill the tenants. They lived in a point in time in history where if you took a life, your life was fair game. That was often how it was resolved. And that he would give the vineyard to others. And if we think through this in the manner of the parable aspect, God, with the religious leaders, could some of them have accepted salvation after this, or were they so hard-hearted that they didn't? I don't know that we actually know that. I would imagine that quite a few of them, are spending eternity separated from God due to their decisions. But the point of all this and in this section is the reminder that Jesus came, and he came of his own free will, and he came to die, and he came to offer that salvation. And you got the points up here. How the parable continued. Jesus sharing about the vineyard owner and how he sent his son that day. That the tenant farmers conspired to kill him, thinking that if they got rid of him, that everything would be theirs. Again, kind of missing the point of the parable. And then Jesus, he's asking rhetorically what would happen next, and how that would be redressed. Like I said, to kind of finish it here, in three things to keep in mind. The tenant farmers represented the extent to which human beings had become corrupt. The tenant farmers are us. The owner's actions, showed how much God cares for people. Like I said, I don't think many of us would send our only child to die intentionally for that, especially for others. We want to hold them for ourselves. And third, the owner's wrath toward the farmers warns of God's judgment against anyone who rejects Jesus and his sacrifice. We know what the outcome is if we reject salvation. It's very clear. You can read you can skip to the end of the book, and you see what happens when you don't accept that. So, a lot to think about there. Jonathan, I'll turn it back over for the last section here.
So the last section, of course, we're going to read 16b through 19, and it's titled The Stone. But Mr. Price, I think one thing to your point, to your question, this is a point in time where I believe Jesus was really shifting gears. And when I say shifting gears in his ministry, I believe he was pointing to the New Testament church that would be established. And we all know that the New Testament church was comprised primarily of Gentiles. And so it was also a push and pull between the religious leaders that believed they had kept the law flawlessly to Jesus basically saying, my church that I'm going to establish, you think back to his conversation with Peter, on this rock I will establish my church. But the Gentiles primarily were the early church and the New Testament church. So I think it's really where Jesus is shifting gears here in his ministry, and that would come with a great deal of resistance from the religious leaders because it jeopardizes their power, their money, their fame, which they've become so accustomed to. So let's read these verses in 16 through 19. When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written? And he's referencing Psalm 118, verse 22 here. It says, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken into pieces. Anyone whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people. So we see two groups of people and we see two responses. Okay? We see the people that were there, that were listening, that were not the religious leaders, the crowd that Jeff talked about a little bit earlier, and then we see the religious leaders. So let's talk a little bit about the two different responses. The people that were there were hearing, in the end of verse 16, what was their response? God forbid. I can't believe this happened, right? How could this have actually transpired? They killed his son. And then let's flip it over on the other side of the coin. What was the response of the religious leaders?
They were plotting to kill him.
They were mad. They were angry. You know, when I read this and I listened to this parable, I thought about 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. And that's where we see Nathan confronting David. You remember? Nathan was telling the story about the ewe lamb, of the poor man with the ewe lamb, and the rich individual that had hundreds and hundreds of lambs. And instead of using one of his lambs for the celebration and the feast, he went, stole the poor man's ewe lamb that he cared for so much, and he slaughtered it for the celebration. And we see David's response. And we know throughout the Old Testament, David was a man after God's own heart. But what was David's response to Nathan? He was angry. He was mad. He was fierce. He was going to send his army to kill this individual. Like he was mad. And then Nathan confronted him and he said, "You are that man." And then Nathan, when he said that, David's tune changed. And his response was then different. And we know that him to be repentant at that point. But the religious leaders were not that. The religious leaders wanted to put Jesus to death. And we see the difference in the way that we respond. Jesus' teaching, Jesus' word, he always invokes a response. It always invokes a response. Isaiah 8:14 through 15 says, "He will be a holy place, both Israel and Judah. He will be a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble, they will fall, and they will be broken. They will be snared and captured." The religious leaders and many of the Israelites were resistant because they were looking for something so different than Jesus. They wanted somebody that was powerful. They wanted a military leader. They wanted a regime. They wanted safety and security. Jesus provides all of that for us, provided all of that for them, but it just didn't meet their expectations. Sometimes I think we probably get caught up in the expectations of what we believe God should be or should do. And it causes us to have separation. But the bottom line and the whole theme of this, and I'll come back to Matthew 16:26, it says, "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, but he forfeits his soul?" We have a choice. We have two choices. The religious leaders had two choices. The people that were hearing had two choices. Everyone worldwide, collectively, all of humanity has two choices. The first choice is you can accept Jesus as the cornerstone of your life. Thus, he will be the cornerstone of the church here locally and collectively worldwide. That comes with a price. That comes with the price of putting faith in Jesus Christ and following Jesus and following his teachings and living a life devoted to him. The second is to reject Jesus as the cornerstone of your life, thus inevitably rejecting Jesus Christ as the cornerstone of the church and thus here locally and collectively. But the two choices have two very distinct paths and it has two distinct consequences. One is going to lead to eternal life with Jesus Christ, and the second will lead to eternal destruction and separation from Jesus Christ. You know, it's interesting that we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the hearers other than the religious leaders. But we don't know when they said, "God forbid," and their anger was invoked, if they ever got to a place of salvation in Jesus Christ. The Bible doesn't tell us that. So we have to understand the response to Jesus has to be more than just the emotional response. It has to go the next step to where we put faith in Jesus Christ. And you can see on the screen the crowd protested the vineyard being given to others. Jesus directed them to Psalms 118 verse 22, and we've read that several times. Jesus taught that the rejected stone, the Son, and in this case that's representative of Jesus Christ. that 3 days later would be crucified at the cross, and then 3 days after that he'd be raised from the dead. And then the religious leaders understood the parable. They understood what Jesus was saying, and it angered them. But they refrained from attacking him because they were afraid of the crowd. So we've got a few key points that Jeff's going to go through here, and then we'll close.
It's definitely a parable that makes you think. It makes you think from different angles about how, we certainly understand and and with the points here, God offers salvation through faith in Jesus alone. That's at the end of the day, that's the message, and that's Jesus made it very clear that no one comes to the Father but through Him. Mistreating God's servants points to disrespect for God. Believers demonstrate, can't read from the side here, respect for the Father through expressing faith in Jesus, and failing to accept Jesus brings judgment. And Judy, I think you're spot on that last one. We do have a choice. At the end of the day, it is an individual choice in how you respond to things. And that goes across the board in how we respond to things. And I don't know how the religious leaders would have varied had Jesus tried to bring them in and with their and play to their influence, or and that's. I think we see that. I think we see that even in today's culture and how people want to be. They don't want to hear right or wrong. They just want to hear how they can be pulled in, and how how their segment of it can be included, and that makes it challenging. But I think as we work our way through things, this parable clearly does point out Dwayne's comment. We know God's in control. We know that at the end of the day, it's His decision. And personally, I'm just thankful that He made the decision He did and sent Jesus, that we would have this opportunity. So